Oh, hello, everybody, and welcome to the Saturday streaming edition of Adam's Music Box. I'm just checking to make sure that you can hear me. Looks like you should be able to. At least I hope. They really ought to have something that tells me if you can hear me or not, but I'll just trust that things are okay and that I'm not talking to myself. So, what a week it's been. Not a very happy one for those who love music. We've lost so many big stars. We've lost Chuck Mangione, who I've done a video on, one of the great sort of laid back jazzmen of the 70s, 80s, and beyond. Of course, his career started much earlier than that, in the early 60s with his brother Gap, a wonderful pianist in his own right. We lost Hulk Hogan, who, of course, from a musical perspective, is implicitly linked to Rick Derringer, who wrote his theme song, I Am a Real American. But of course, in terms of cultural phenoms, cultural giants that we lost in the world of music, the two biggest ones of the summer, the two biggest losses are Brian Wilson and Ozzy Osbourne. And their music will be remembered forever. And I wanted to talk about some of their similarities and some of their differences, because while the differences might be more apparent, their impact on culture was huge and in ways that just might be more similar than we think. So on paper, they're very, very different. The Beach Boys, the Wilson family, after being born in the Midwest, they went along with their cousins were already there, the Love family, but they went west and moved to Southern California, and they created the soundtrack to modern post-war Southern California. A very different place from post war Birmingham, England, where Black Sabbath was formed, where there wasn't much sun and there wasn't much fun. There were, unexploded ordnances from the war, buildings that still hadn't been rebuilt. The poor couldn't afford indoor plumbing, and there were plenty of factories, but that's a long way from Hawthorne in California, where the Wilson family were from. And of course, there are musical differences, but the musical differences, I think, betray something else. So obviously, the early hits of the Beach Boys that were written by Brian Wilson, they extol the virtues of what was then the modern Southern California lifestyle, surfing, car culture, the whole shebang, the girls at the beach, boy meets girl under the sun, and everyone's having a good time. By contrast, Black Sabbath were talking about the mystical. They were talking about the dark. They were talking about the spiritual. They were talking about salvation. Because while the themes were dark and it dealt with temptation, it dealt with demons, the message in the lyrics was always one of avoid the demonic and go to the light, even though the world is shrouded in darkness. But again, on the surface, very different messages that were being conveyed in the lyrics. And of course, the style of the music, because both Brian Wilson and Black Sabbath were inventors of a new style. Of course, there were predecessors to both, but it was Brian Wilson who put that California sound on the map, and the music was generally very upbeat. The harmonies were very sophisticated, where the Black Sabbath music was equally original, and it sounded like the darkness. It sounded like demons. It sounded like Lucifer was coming. So again, very, very different. But then something happened along the way. Brian Wilson, as an individual, was someone who himself was very much consumed by his own demons that were, of course, fed by various drugs and other substances. And by the time he wrote his, what most people would consider his sort of magnum opus, Pet Sounds, well, not magnum, but his, his grand work, Pet Sounds, he was someone who was dealing with subjects that really were quite removed from the early days of Surf and Safari and Surfing USA and 409. Just this is the thematic nature of it. I just wasn't made for these times. that could be an Ozzy Osbourne lyric when you really think of it. Wouldn't it be nice if we were older? Well, this is about, instead of extolling the virtues of what is, it's dreaming about what could be. And with the avant-garde moves into Smile, some of which was released on Smiley Smile, others was shelved for later, the Beach Boys continued to delve into themes that were increasingly removed from their early music. And meanwhile, the wonderful musical harmony, the instrumental harmony, and the vocal harmony continued to get more sophisticated across albums like Wild Honey, 2020, Surf's Up, and the title track of Surf's Up, you could argue, was one of Brian Wilson's finest moments in terms of a song, along with probably God Only Knows and Good Vibrations. Now, one thing also that these two figures, Ozzy and Brian Wilson, have in common is that they were well known, even among people that might not have listened to the Beach Boys on a daily or even weekly basis. And the same goes for Ozzy. Even if you didn't listen to any heavy metal, let alone Ozzy's music or his Black Sabbath albums, even if you didn't listen to those on a regular basis, you knew who he and Black Sabbath were, in the same way that people knew who Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys were, because they transcended the musical ecosystem and they burst into the wider cultural space. They changed the way that culture worked, because the Beach Boys had such a profound shaping effect on the wider popular culture beyond just music. And the same was true for Black Sabbath and Ozzy Osbourne. And one of the reasons is, there's several, but one of the reasons is because both were true originals. And in music, originality is very difficult. I would argue also that originality is kind of overrated. I think you need to convey emotional sincerity in music. I think you need to do something that people just want to listen to. That sounds very simplistic, but if people don't want to listen to it, if it doesn't have that sort of attraction, that metaphysical element to it that makes people magnetically drawn to it, people aren't going to like it. And the other thing is that both Ozzy and Brian Wilson's music you could dress up to. Now, Frank Zappa once made a comment that pop music becomes popular, or I suppose better put, music becomes pop music if you can dress up to it. And I think that's absolutely true. Now, the subtext to that, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but I certainly believe that a lot of the music that has a kind of dress code, that has the sort of obligatory costumery that goes along with it, a lot of it is very simplistic music where the costumes tend to become the main attraction and the music serves as more of a soundtrack, more of an underscore. I don't see it this way with Ozzy or Brian Wilson. It's not that I just don't see it that way. The objective reality is that musically, Brian Wilson and Black Sabbath were incredibly sophisticated. So, in creating genres of music that had an image, a dress code, a costume, they did so, but not at the expense of music that was both revolutionary and sophisticated from a technical point of view, enduring in terms of the fact that it didn't get old, and the fact that it was just really brilliantly executed, including on top of the fact that it was brilliantly written. So that was something else that I think that they had in common. When you close your eyes and think of the Beach Boys, you see certain things. When you close your eyes and think of Ozzy Osbourne and Black Sabbath, you do the same. Very different things, but they definitely have an image. Not all bands do. Not all solo artists do either. Now, what were some other similarities? I think they both help to challenge the way that members of the public think of mental illness, because both dealt with problems that weren't all too dissimilar. Brian Wilson became incredibly depressed in the mid 60s. Part of it may have been a result of the fact that Murray Wilson, his and his brother's father, that goes without saying, was incredibly strict, and from what we can tell, not particularly sympathetic. Now, again, history isn't what we always think it is. When the source material you're dealing with is limited, you're only getting one side. Maybe the people who say that Murray Wilson was too harsh were basing it just on a few recordings of him in the studio being quite rude, quite overbearing, and we don't have the full picture. So I don't want to be the judge of that per se. But what we do know, because it's by his own admission and by the admission of his brothers, is that Brian Wilson slipped into what we would generally consider a depressive state sometime around the mid to late 60s, and drugs became a part of his life. Excessive drinking became a part of it, and he battled demons. He was very honest about it. He came out of this sort of haze in the late 70s, then retreated back and came out again in the 80s. There was this, Dr. Landy, Eugene Landy, who I always thought was a controversial figure, but maybe I need to step back there too, because there were many instances where Brian Wilson actually did thank him, but then again, his kids thought that maybe he was this sort of overbearing guy who tended to use Brian as his own sort of musical servant. So we might never get the full story there either. But irrespective of that, Brian Wilson was not a man who had an easy life. He had a lot of success. He made a lot of money, lost it, made some of it back. But again, these psychological and emotional demons were part of his story. So too with Ozzy Osbourne. Ozzy was someone who was well known to partake in a lot of drugs and other substances. He had various mental episodes, so much so that by the end of the 70s, even though the music, in my view, was still really good, Never Say Die was a really good album. Once that album and subsequent tour were done, Ozzy was kicked out of the band that he co-founded. And most people thought, right, well, that's it for Ozzy. And when Black Sabbath then got their own, got a new singer who happened to do very well, people doubled down on the idea that, yeah, Ozzy is finished. But he wasn't finished, because he did have a lifeline in Sharon, who, by all accounts, where Dr. Landy is very controversial as one of Brian Wilson's lifelines. Most people agree that, while very tough and very opinionated, that Sharon was Ozzy's lifeline. She got him, out of the house and back into the studio, back on the road, and surrounded him by a wonderful band, anchored, of course, by the late, great Randy Rhoads. And I think, looking at both of these stories of resilience, Ozzy first overcoming the difficulty of being kicked out of the only professional environment he had known, and then becoming a huge solo artist, and then years later becoming sober. Brian Wilson's battles, triumphs, tribulations, and ultimate re-emergence as a clean figure in the 90s. I think that there are a lot of parallels there, and I think that there are also a lot of pitfalls, because one of the dangers in the fact that mental health issues are less taboo than they used to be. I wouldn't say they're not taboo, because there are people right now who are suffering because people around them are mocking them or deriding them or making them more depressed because of the things going on in their environment and the things going on cognitively and psychologically. But there is a danger that we go to another extreme and that we over-medicate. I'm someone who's very much against any form of mind-altering drugs, unless they're done under very, very specific circumstances. And that's my view, whether they're recreational or allegedly medicinal. I think that you've got to really have the right kind of environment. And I think that when it comes to that also, I think psychedelics are much more valuable to people suffering from anxiety and depression than a lot of the pharmaceutical concoctions that we have a lot of knowledge of terrible side effects that are associated with them. Things like SSRIs. The industry, of course, doesn't want us to talk about it. I might lose my YouTube channel over it, though I think things are improved. I am on X, by the way, Adam's Music Box. On X. Let me actually find the handle, because if I do get kicked off of here, hopefully good old Elon will let me stay. And all of the videos, all of the content that I post here on YouTube, I also post on X. So let me just get that, because these handles are sometimes different than the username. So the handle, so the at is at Adam's Music Box, all one word. So definitely check me out there. I upload the videos to Rumble too, but I mainly use that as an archive, because Rumble's great for free speech, great for political content, but in my experience, and maybe this will change, not as good for sort of non-political content, which is technically what this show is, albeit it wasn't, I suppose, in the last 30 seconds. So now that we're becoming more comfortable with talking about mental health the way people weren't when Brian Wilson started to struggle in the 60s, or when Syd Barrett had his incidents, let's say, not too long after Brian Wilson, or when Ozzy was having his, difficult time between Black Sabbath and Blizzard of Oz. We weren't as comfortable with talking about it. And now that we are, and it seems that we're reverting to what I would almost call chemical lobotomy, this overprescription and over medication of mind altering substances, including but not limited to SSRIs. A lot of people forget that until the late 1940s, frontal lobe lobotomies were considered a completely ethical and a completely efficacious way of treating depression and other forms of mental anxiety. And this is when you would actually have the frontal lobe of your brain physically scrambled by a piece of metal that's stuck up your nose. Incredibly primitive, incredibly barbaric, but well into the 20th century, this was considered a perfectly legitimate treatment. And now we can spare ourselves the gruesome imagery of, up the nose and into the brain. But we have chemicals now in the forms of pills that do much the same. So I think we need to be careful, and we need to actually address the root causes of mental health problems, and we need to look for solutions that are more organic and less chemical. Free to disagree. I'm a free speech absolutist, but that's my view. And I think that these are conversations that now we can have in great part because Ozzy and Brian Wilson both showed that resilience is possible, that second chances in the worlds of music and of pop culture are not only possible, but there's something that we can celebrate. And I think that that's why, in addition to their great music, that's why so many people can relate to them, because it showed that not everyone who achieves fame against a lot of odds is able to stay on top and to stay contented, for lack of a better word. And I think it's a very important message. I think resilience is always an admirable thing. Now, back to the music side of things, I think I may have touched on this earlier. There's definitely a trajectory in Beach Boys music from the cheerful to the contemplative and, yes, to the dark. For instance, the Beach Boys' Love You album from the late 70s, which was made after Brian's sort of reemergence from his first sort of period of seclusion. There are some very dark themes, very experimental themes, very interesting themes, and I'm talking both musically and lyrically, where the trajectory with Ozzy Osbourne in many ways is someone whose music got lighter over the years. And I'm not saying that as an insult, because I love all of his music, but towards the sort of middle and later period of his career, he wasn't afraid to do a lot of ballads. He wasn't afraid to do, the tearjerker songs. It wasn't all Crazy Train and Mr. Crowley. It was, it was Mama, I'm Coming Home. It was Dreamer. And yes, Sabbath did have their ballads. They had Changes, for instance. They had some great instrumental numbers like Laguna Sunrise. But it was really as I said, in the middle and later portion of Ozzy's career when he did songs that frankly could have been Beach Boys songs, where the Beach Boys were getting into territory with things like Surf's Up, and later on with things like the Beach Boys' Love You, and even some of the stuff on Holland, which was during the period of Brian's seclusion. That was stuff that was getting heavy, but in the best possible way. I love the heavy, I love the light. It's the yin and the yang. And so it's an interesting sort of dualism when we look at the trajectory of these two great artists in that sense. Now, what are some other similarities that they have? I think that they were able to tame the media, because the media in general, of all of the arts, they're probably, and I'm talking about the mainstream or lamestream or legacy, depending on your preferred term, media, they probably understand less about music than almost any other art form. And here's why. The fine arts, so, fine art, painting and sculpture, there's a lot of money laundering in that industry. And that means that a lot of the people who own, fund, and are adjacent to the people on the boards of directors of the lamestream media outlets, a lot of them can, how shall we say, relate to the fine art business side of things, not necessarily the creative aspects of it, but they can certainly relate to the business aspects of it. They can relate to acting too, because when you're in the media and you're lying, which a lot of people in the media do, you're acting. It's not very high level acting, it's far from Shakespeare in the Park, but there you go. It's acting nevertheless. Where music is both the most abstract and most direct of all of the arts, which leaves it open to a lot of misunderstanding, intentional or otherwise, from the purveyors of fine media. I think Brian Wilson and Ozzy Osbourne were able to transcend that, but it wasn't always the case. Ozzy, for a while, was the butt of jokes. People mocked the way he looked, the way he spoke, the kind of music he played. I mean, when Black Sabbath first came out, the critics loathed them because it was music by regular folks from poor backgrounds, and it was for people who were looking for escapism. It was for people who could relate to demonic and dark themes, but who wanted to have that conclusion of righteousness and salvation, which was the underscore to all of those great lyrics, most of which were written by the great Geezer Butler. Critics hated that. Critics mocked Brian Wilson. I mean, there were people like Howard Stern, who was very mocking of Brian Wilson in his sandbox, and people like that. But I think that this was, in both cases, we the people beat these media attempts to sort of slander these men. They tried to make Brian Wilson seem like a drugged out kook. They tried to make Ozzy seem like some demonic lunatic. But both men, I think, won the public back because both were able, through direct and frequent communication with the public, to demonstrate that, look, these are great resilient people that were bursting with creativity, and for both, creativity was a form of escapism, both during the younger part of their lives and the older part of their lives. In Ozzy's case, the fact that he became the first famous person to go on reality TV was frankly revolutionary, because before that, it was before the Osbournes, reality TV was, okay, let's get Debbie from accounting and see how many sort of lizard exoskeletons and bull semen she can consume before vomiting. Real sophisticated stuff, which is why Joe Rogan himself found it funny that it lost what it did. You should listen to his comments about that. They're very prescient. So it was stuff like that. It was stuff like, put a bunch of young people in the room and see who gets, an unwanted pregnancy. That was the MTV as opposed to the TV. But with the Osbournes, reality TV became something very different. You had someone who was well known to the public for something other than being a reality TV star. He was unknown to the public for being in music. And it took the cameras into his house, and it really showed a side of him that I think made him even more relatable to the public. They thought, well, this guy's just a regular dad with regular dad problems. He's got more money than the average person. Because he's in the arts, he probably dresses and has a different lifestyle to a degree than the average, Debbie in accounting, or Roger at the lawnmower repair shop. But nevertheless, the similarities between Daddy Ozzy and Daddy John down the street were much narrower than the differences. I mean, to put it another, the similarities were more similar than the differences were different, to put it in a tongue-tied sort of way. And I think that really helped the public relate to the guy. And I think that it helped a lot of other people too, by saying, well, hang on, the media that had gate kept these people, that had made Ozzy and Brian Wilson look crazy, well, we put a camera in Ozzy's home 24/7, and he's not crazy at all. He's funny, he's honest, he's compassionate, he's loving to his kids and his wife. He has, he eats, drinks, sleeps, wakes up just like the rest of us. And I think that made people feel a level of humanization with other celebrities too. And I would say that extends to Brian Wilson, who obviously wasn't on a reality show, but the trail that Ozzy and his family blazed, I think, decreased this gate-kept gap between celebrities and the general public. And I think that was super important. And Brian Wilson, on his many interviews that he did increasingly in the final sort of 20, 30 years of his life, I think that helped him to directly dispel a lot of the rumors that the media or his previous handlers put out there. And of course, another similarity is but both men had successful kids in the arts and entertainment sectors. Think Wilson Phillips. Think what Kelly and Jack have done and are doing in arts and entertainment and entrepreneurialism. And I think again that humanizes the whole situation. People like when people go into the family business, unless it's politics. But even then, people like it. Sometimes. But when it comes to the arts and entertainment, I think people like it. At least people with an open mind. I like to see people like Wolfgang Van Halen doing their thing. Wilson Phillips had some great music, and Jack and Kelly, by all accounts, are doing some really interesting stuff. And again, I think that brought things down to a human level because we saw that Brian and Ozzy wanted the best for their kids. They were happy when they succeeded. And again, this destroyed this media narrative that only builds celebrities up in order to tear them down. And it created more of a level. It created a form of neutrality where we can say, right, the best art comes from ordinary people who do extraordinary things. And this is true in classical music, it's true in popular music, it's true in the fine arts, it's true in comedy. And again, people like Ozzy and Brian had ideas that were more interesting than the average bear, and they maybe even had elements of their lifestyle that were more interesting. But at the end of the day, they were human beings. They were human beings made of the same flesh, the same mother and father, the same God as all of us, same universe, however you want to put it. And yet they had these extraordinary ideas. They invented things like Nikola Tesla. They were inventors, and their invention was in the world of art, specifically the world of music. And their stamp is so indelible that I think even in 100 years, when people think of what's the soundtrack to surfing, what's the soundtrack to modifying and racing cars, they'll think of the Beach Boys. When people think what's one of the most sincere love songs of all time, they'll think God Only Knows. When they think what's one of the most interesting songs that was part of the psychedelic period but not bogged down with its stereotypes, Good Vibrations. And when people think about dark, heavy metal, hard music, they are always going to think of Paranoid and Children of the Grave and Into the Void and Iron Man. They're going to think of Randy Rhoads and his solo on Crazy Train. They're going to play Bark at the Moon. They're going to play No More Tears. They're going to cry to Mama I'm Coming Home. These are cultural artifacts because think of it as sort of the levels of a video game. When you're a great musician, you can achieve a certain level. But when you're a great musician who's able to maintain your musical integrity, but break into that higher level of cultural penetration beyond beyond the fortress of the music world, that is something very special. It's always been very unique. And now that our culture is very sort of bifurcated by social media, where there's something for everyone, but there's very little singular acts, singular pieces of art for everyone. I think that the age of a Brian Wilson and the age of an Ozzy Osbourne might never repeat itself, certainly not for the next several generations. But who knows? So that's what I think about some of the important differences, but more important similarities between Brian Wilson and Ozzy Osbourne. As always, let me know what you think, like, subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Take care, and of course, rest in peace to two great musicians and all of the others, including Chuck Mangione, including Rick Derringer, that we've lost this year. Hopefully we won't lose any more. Take care.